The chronometer says I've been awake for 47 seconds. That's a lie. I've been awake for 6,000 years. At least that's what my mind tells me. What every screaming nerve in my brain insists is true, even though the numbers on the wall haven't changed since I last looked. Since I last blinked. Was that a blink? It felt like a decade passed in the darkness behind my eyelids. Entire civilizations rising and falling in the microsecond it took for my eyes to close and open again. Empires born and destroyed in the brief moment of voluntary blindness that should have lasted a fraction of a second, but instead stretched across subjective centuries, while my consciousness experienced every attosecond as its own distinct eternity. My name is Marcus Cale, and I was 28 years old when we launched from Terra. I was an agricultural engineer, assigned to the Distant Hope, the Imperium's first deep space colony vessel, bound for a system they called Proxima Mor. They told us we were heroes, pioneers, that our names would be remembered across the millennia as the first humans to establish a foothold in the uncharted dark beyond the Astronomican's light, that we were extending the God Emperor's sacred domain into regions where his holy illumination had never touched and probably never would. They lied about that too. They lied about everything, really, though I suppose they didn't know they were lying at the time. Didn't understand the fundamental nature of the horror they were sending us toward when they loaded 3,000 men onto a vessel barely adequate for long-term void travel and launched us into darkness with promises of glory and imperial recognition and all the comfortable propaganda they feed to people they're sending to die in ways they haven't imagined yet. There were 3,000 of us when we departed. Men recruited from the agri-worlds and industrial sectors, specialists in hydroponics and atmospheric processing, technicians trained in void suit maintenance and radiation shielding, engineers like me who understood nutrient cycling and protein synthesis, and all the mundane sciences required to keep human beings alive in environments actively hostile to biological existence. I remember my father's face at the departure terminal, his weathered hands gripping my shoulders, telling me he was proud, that I'd come back with stories that would make the family name legendary across our entire agri-world. I can still see his face, every detail, every line carved by years of labor under harsh sunlight, every scar from agricultural accidents, every gray hair at his temples. That's the worst part. Understand, I can see it with perfect clarity, because I've been looking at that memory for what feels like 3,000 years now, examining it from every angle, reliving that moment so many times that it's worn grooves into my consciousness like water-eroding stone, like the same thought repeated across geological timescales, until it becomes a canyon in the landscape of memory. The launch was smooth, professional. We spent the first 6 months, real months measured by ship chronometers and duty rosters and the reliable progression of objective time, in standard void transit. I worked the hydroponics bay on Deck 7, cultivating protein-rich algae in nutrient vats the size of hab blocks. The work was repetitive but honest, the kind of labor that didn't require complex thought, just attention to detail and adherence to procedure. I'd eat my corpse starch rations in the communal mess with the other engineers, and we'd talk about what we'd build when we reached Proxima Mor. Gardens. Actual gardens with real soil shipped in cryo-containers, not the synthetic substrate we used aboard ship. Trees, maybe, if we could convince the administratum to allocate resources for something as frivolous as aesthetic vegetation. Darius was the closest thing I had to a friend. He was 42, a hydroponics specialist from Necromunda who'd lost his son to hive gang violence and volunteered for the colony to escape the memories, to put as much physical distance as possible between himself and the place where his child had died in ways he refused to describe. We'd work adjacent shifts, sometimes talking across the vat barriers about absolutely nothing important. Ration flavors, which deck had the most reliable atmospheric recyclers. Whether the tech priests conducting the ship's rituals actually understood the machinery or just performed their superstitious chants while routine maintenance happened automatically in the background. "You think they know?" Darius asked me once, maybe 3 months into transit. We were calibrating nutrient flow to VAT 17, our hands stained green from algae exposure, the smell of growing protein thick in the recycled air. Know what? What any of this actually does. He gestured at the pipes and valves surrounding us, the complex network of machinery that kept the hydroponic system functional. The tech priests. They wave their incense and chant binary cant, but I've read the technical manuals they keep locked in their sacred archives. It's just engineering. Mundane, explicable engineering dressed up in religious theater to make it seem more important than it actually is. I'd shrugged, uncomfortable with the direction of conversation. Wasn't my place to question Mechanicus' doctrine, even if I privately agreed with his assessment. Doesn't matter, as long as the systems function. Suppose not. He'd looked at the machinery with something between contempt and resignation. Still seems dishonest, though. Calling maintenance prayer and pretending machines have souls that need appeasing. But I guess that's how the Imperium works. Everything has to be sacred. Everything has to serve some higher purpose. Can't just admit we're biological machines, maintaining mechanical machines in an indifferent universe that doesn't care about our rituals. That was the last conversation I remember having that felt normal. Human. Before everything changed. Before the radiation leak that the tech priests, blessed be the Omnissiah, praised be the machine god, all the ritualistic phrases they drilled into us through repetitive conditioning, failed to detect until it was far, far too late to matter. The official logs, the ones I can still access through the ship's corrupted data stream when I manage to interface with what's left of the cogitator banks, say the leak began on day 187 of transit. A microscopic fracture in the plasma reactor shielding, caused by what they never determined. Maybe a manufacturing defect that quality control missed. Maybe simple entropy, the universe exercising its inherent tendency toward disorder. Maybe the machine spirit was angry, as the tech priests would later insist before they went mad like everyone else, and started dismantling their own augmetics in desperate attempts to escape consciousness. We didn't notice at first. That's crucial to understand. The radiation wasn't conventional. Wasn't something our dosimeters could detect. Wasn't the clean death of hard gamma radiation or the slow genetic corruption of alpha particles. This was something stranger, something operating on principles that Imperial science hadn't catalogued despite millennia of technological development. Later, when I still had the capacity for hypothesis and rational thought, I wondered if we'd brushed against something from the warp itself, some echo of unreality leaking into our dimensions through that fracture in the reactor core, some property of chaos that affected consciousness directly rather than physical matter. The first symptom was dreams. I remember waking from a sleep cycle, standard 8 hours according to my bunk's chronometer, feeling like I'd been asleep for months. Years, even. Centuries, if I'm being honest about the subjective experience. I'd dreamed of my father's farm on the agri-world. The same dream I'd had countless times before, familiar imagery of fields and harvest equipment, and the comfortable monotony of agricultural labor. But this time it felt different, longer. I'd watched entire growing seasons pass in that dream, planting and harvesting cycles that stretched across what my mind insisted were decades of experience, while my father aged and withered and eventually collapsed in the fields from simple exhaustion, and I'd tried to reach him, but my legs moved through molasses-thick time. Each step taking years to complete, while he died meters away and I was powerless to close the distance. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat that smelled wrong somehow. 47 minutes had passed according to the bunk chronometer. 47 minutes of objective time, while my consciousness had experienced what felt like 30 years of dreaming. Bad dream? Darius asked from the adjacent bunk. He looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in weeks, his skin pale in the bunk compartment's dim lighting. "You look terrible," I told him. "Feel worse. Had the strangest dream, lived an entire life in it. Met a woman, had children, watched them grow old and have children of their own. Grandchildren. great-grandchildren. Watched generations pass while I somehow stayed the same age. Then I woke up and remembered women don't exist anymore. Haven't existed in my life since I left Necromunda. And the whole thing collapsed in my head like it was never real, like my brain had constructed an entire false history just to torture me with impossible memories. I wanted to tell him that was impossible, that dreams don't work that way, that you can't experience subjective years in minutes of REM sleep, no matter how vivid the imagery or how real it feels in the moment. But I'd just experienced something similar, and the words died in my throat before I could voice them. Some part of me understood that denying his experience would be denying my own, and I wasn't ready to confront the implications of what was happening to us. Probably just void adaptation, I said instead, choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truth. Brain adjusting to confined spaces and recycled air. Extended isolation from normal environmental stimuli happens to void crew sometimes, or so I've heard. Probably. Neither of us believed it. I could see the doubt in his eyes, could recognize it because I felt the same doubt gnawing at my own certainty about the nature of reality. The dreams got worse over the following weeks. Or rather, they got longer, subjectively longer, while objective time continued its normal progression indifferent to our experiences. Every sleep cycle became an ordeal we dreaded rather than the restorative rest human biology requires. We'd close our eyes for our mandated rest period and experience what felt like months of dreaming, wandering through impossible scenarios that our consciousnesses insisted were real and lasting and permanent. I attended my father's funeral in one dream. It lasted 4 days. 4 days of mourning and ritual, and standing by his grave while rain fell and seasons changed, and decades somehow passed in the space of a single dream funeral that my mind told me was absolute reality. Complete with sensory details I couldn't have invented, and emotional weight I couldn't have fabricated. When I woke, 18 minutes had elapsed. The chronometer confirmed it. The ship's master clock confirmed it. But my brain, my consciousness, the subjective experience of me that insisted I'd been gone far longer, that I'd lived through days of experience that objective reality claimed never happened. We reported it to the ship's medical officer, a severe man named Hadrian who trained in the Schola Medicae on Mars, and carried himself with the clinical detachment they apparently teach in those institutions. He ran neurological scans, blood panels, genetic screens, psychological evaluations, found nothing abnormal. Every test came back within expected parameters, told us our brain chemistry was within acceptable ranges, and prescribed mild sedatives to calm disrupted sleep patterns and reduce REM intensity. The sedatives made it worse. I took the first dose and closed my eyes for my scheduled rest period, expecting the medication to provide dreamless sleep, or at least reduce the subjective duration of whatever dreams occurred. Instead, I experienced 400 years of solitary confinement in a white room with no features and no stimulation, while my mind slowly unraveled into madness across centuries of enforced isolation, only to wake 7 minutes later to discover I'd barely entered REM sleep at all, that my brain had constructed 4 centuries of experience in the brief chemical fog of sedation. Stopped taking the sedatives after that, flushed the pills down the waste recycler, and accepted that natural sleep, however distorted, was preferable to chemically induced eternities of nightmare consciousness. So did everyone else who'd been prescribed them. Within a month, a real month, 28 days marked on calendars and duty rosters, more than 1,000 men aboard the Distant Hope were reporting similar symptoms. Time dilation during sleep. Dreams that stretched across subjective centuries. Waking exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure, because rest itself had become a torture chamber where consciousness was stretched like skin across an infinite frame. Pulled thinner and thinner until it should break, but somehow never does, just continues stretching across impossible durations while remaining aware of every moment. The tech priests claimed it was spiritual corruption. that we'd traveled too far from terror's holy light, from the Astronomican's psychic beacon and the God Emperor's supposed divine protection, and now suffered what they called the temporal malaise of the faithless. They prescribed prayer and ritual, forced us to attend 6-hour chanting sessions in the ship's chapel, where we recited the litany of astronomical navigation, until our throats bled and our minds went numb from repetition. Until the words became meaningless sounds divorced from any semantic content. It changed nothing. The chanting just gave us more material for the dreams, more sensory information for our expanding consciousnesses to process across impossible timescales. I'd close my eyes and experience centuries of praying to the God Emperor. Praised be his name, eternal be his vigilance. All the phrases they'd programmed into us through years of conditioning, while knowing somewhere deep in my awareness that he wasn't listening, had never listened, that I was screaming into an indifferent void, wearing the mask of divinity to lure prey. Then I'd wake. 8 minutes elapsed according to every objective measurement device. Month 4 after the dreams began, we noticed the chronometers were lying even when we were awake. I'd be working in the hydroponics bay, calibrating nutrient flow to VAT 2003, and I'd glance at my wrist chronometer. 0847 hours. I'd adjust the valve. A simple task. Routine maintenance should take maybe 30 seconds of objective time. But when I finished and looked again, the chronometer still read 0847 hours. No time had passed. Or rather, so little time had passed that the device couldn't register the change with its display resolution, while my mind insisted I'd been standing there adjusting that valve for weeks. My hands moving in slow motion through some medium thicker than reality itself, every micro-rotation of the mechanism stretching across days of subjective experience. Darius noticed it too. We all did. Every man aboard the ship was experiencing the same fundamental disconnect between subjective consciousness and objective time. The ship's master clock says 3 minutes passed during last shift, he told me one day, his voice hollow and distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. I lived through 16 years. I know I did. I can remember every day, every single day, Marcus. Every breakfast in the mess, every maintenance check, every conversation we had about nothing important. 16 years of memories crammed into 3 minutes of objective time, and I can't make my brain understand that those years weren't real, that they didn't happen, that I'm supposed to dismiss 16 years of lived experience as some kind of neurological malfunction. Maybe they were real, I said, and immediately regretted voicing the thought. What? Maybe, I struggled for words, trying to articulate a hypothesis I didn't fully understand myself. Maybe our perception is what's real. Maybe subjective experience is the only reality that matters. Maybe the chronometers are wrong. Maybe we've actually been out here for years, and something's broken in the ship's timekeeping systems, and all the supposedly objective measurements are lying to us about how long we've been traveling. The wear patterns on the equipment don't match, Darius interrupted. He'd clearly thought about this too, had spent his own subjective years analyzing the problem from every angle. The algae growth cycles are consistent with 6 months of cultivation, not years. The consumables inventory matches the departure date. The reactor fuel consumption is exactly what it should be for half a year of operation. Either we've been here 6 months and we're all going insane in identical ways, or we've been here for years and the entire physical universe is conspiring to lie to us about objective reality. We stared at each other. Both possibilities were equally horrifying. Either we were losing our minds and our subjective experiences couldn't be trusted, or the universe itself had become fundamentally deceptive and our consciousnesses were the only honest things left. The medical officer couldn't explain it, couldn't even begin to formulate hypotheses that accounted for our symptoms. The tech priests blamed insufficient faith in the machine god. More prayers, more rituals, more incense, and chanting and meaningless ceremonies that changed nothing and helped no one. Some men started refusing to sleep at all. medicating themselves with stimulants from the ship's pharmacy until their hearts gave out from exhaustion. Better to die, they reasoned, than experience another 1,000 years of nightmare consciousness compressed into minutes of unwanted rest. I tried to stay awake once. Made it 63 hours. Real, objective hours confirmed by multiple chronometers and witness testimony. Felt like 900 years, every second stretched into a small eternity of consciousness. I'd watch my hand move across the control panel in the hydroponics bay, and it would take what felt like months for my fingers to travel those few centimeters of physical space. I could feel every microsecond of the motion, could experience the journey from one position to another as a vast expedition across impossible durations. I could analyze every instant of consciousness across subjective timescales that human language doesn't have words for, while my body moved through objective reality at normal speed, creating a disconnect so profound that I began to question whether I was actually a physical being at all, or just a consciousness experiencing the hallucination of physicality. My thoughts would spiral through endless loops during that period, thinking about the valve I was adjusting, then thinking about it, then thinking about it. Recursive layers of awareness that extended across what felt like decades of introspective analysis, all happening in the supposed space of a single moment. I'd examine one thought from every possible angle, explore every semantic implication, follow every associative connection, until the original thought had expanded into a vast tree of related concepts, spanning subjective years of contemplation. When I finally collapsed from exhaustion, I experienced 60,000 years of dreamless void before waking 3 hours later. The colony ship AI, a simple logistical system, not anything approaching true artificial intelligence, just automated resource management protocols that the Mechanicus called a semi-blessed calculation engine, to make it sound more impressive, began reporting anomalies around month 7, not in the crew, in reality itself. Local time dilation effects, quantum fluctuations in the ship's chronometric field that shouldn't be possible without massive gravitational sources or relativistic velocities we weren't approaching. Causality violations too small to matter practically, but large enough to detect with sensitive equipment, effects preceding causes by microseconds, information propagating backwards through time in tiny, impossible ways that violated everything we understood about how the universe operates. The tech priests insisted this was normal, nothing to be concerned about, just relativistic effects from traveling at significant fractions of light speed. Perfectly explicable by standard imperial physics and the blessed equations of the omnisphere, they claimed. They were lying. Had to be. Because standard relativity doesn't cause consciousness to experience centuries while seconds elapse. Doesn't make men live through entire lifetimes in the space of a heartbeat while the universe around them denies it ever happened. Standard physics might account for small temporal anomalies, might explain microsecond-scale causality violations, but it couldn't explain what was happening to us, the fundamental untethering of subjective experience from objective time. The radiation leak wasn't detected until month 8. By then, it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. Whatever we'd been exposed to had already fundamentally altered our relationship with time, had changed something basic about how our consciousnesses interfaced with temporal progression. A junior tech priest named Sarrazin, young, barely 20, still idealistic enough to question his training, ran unauthorized scans of the reactor core after noticing prayer rituals were taking subjectively longer to perform. He'd chant the litany of plasma containment, supposed to take 6 minutes. He'd performed it thousands of times during his apprenticeship, but it would feel like hours, days even. His consciousness stretched across vast subjective durations, while his mouth mechanically formed words, and his body moved through the ritual motions in normal time, creating the same disconnect we all experienced, but focused specifically during his religious obligations. Made him curious, made him wonder if maybe the reactor itself was experiencing some kind of temporal distortion, some field effect that was propagating throughout the ship and affecting everyone aboard. He was smart enough to think scientifically despite his religious training, capable of formulating hypotheses and designing experiments to test them. The scans revealed the microscopic fracture in the containment shielding, something invisible to standard maintenance protocols, too small for visual inspection, too quantum uncertain for conventional sensors to detect without specifically looking for temporal anomalies, but leaking something. Some kind of exotic radiation that official imperial classification hadn't catalogued, that none of our training had prepared us for. Something that interfaced with consciousness itself, with the subjective experience of duration, warping the phenomenological perception of time while leaving objective physical reality completely untouched. Sarrazin brought his findings to the senior tech priests. They called him a heretic, accused him of doubting the sacred reliability of the machine spirits and questioning the blessed function of imperial technology, subjected him to penitence rituals that lasted, according to ship chronometry, 4 hours. He experienced 6 centuries of punishment. They made him kneel on metal grating while reciting prayers of contrition, while electric current pulsed through his augmetics at levels just below permanent damage. 4 hours of objective time. 600 years of subjective agony as his consciousness stretched across impossible durations of pain, experiencing every microsecond of electrical torture as its own distinct eternity. When they released him, he tried to kill himself by venting his quarters to vacuum. Didn't work. The safety systems caught the pressure drop and sealed the compartment before he could die. They locked him in medical restraints and sedated him, and he spent what he later claimed were 15,000 years trapped in a paralyzed body, experiencing drug-induced nightmares before they finally let him wake. Before the sedatives wore off and he regained enough motor control to communicate. 2 hours had passed in objective time. He succeeded in killing himself the second time, dismantled a plasma welder and used it to vaporize his own brain, destroying his cerebral cortex before anyone could stop him. They found his body slumped over the workbench, the modified welder still clutched in his dead hands, his skull opened and the contents flash-boiled to vapor. The suicide note, carved into the workbench surface with a monomolecular blade, was 90,000 words long. He'd written it in the 3 seconds between deciding to die and pulling the trigger. His consciousness experiencing years of desperate explanation compressed into an eye blink of objective time, his hand moving at normal speed, while his mind composed a vast treatise on the nature of suffering and consciousness and the horror of existing across impossible temporal scales. I read it, most of it anyway, before my own stretched consciousness made the activity unbearable. The grammar degraded toward the end, as his language centers struggled to keep pace with the accelerated subjective time he was experiencing. Words blurred together into neologisms and recursive phrases that barely made sense, describing experiences and sensations that human language hadn't evolved to communicate. Concepts that required new vocabulary because nothing in our linguistic heritage addressed the horror of consciousness stretched across geological timescales. The core message was clear, though, repeated in various formulations throughout the 90,000-word suicide note: "Kill me before I experience eternity. I cannot endure consciousness any longer. Every moment is forever, and I am trapped in forever until forever consumes me completely, and there is nothing left but awareness of my own awareness, extending infinitely in all directions." After Sarrazon's death, the suicides started in earnest. Men would dismantle their own bodies in increasingly creative ways, desperate to destroy their brains quickly enough that they couldn't experience the subjective centuries of dying. Explosive decompression was popular initially. Open an airlock and let vacuum burst your cranium before pain signals could travel from nerve endings to consciousness. Plasma weapons, set to maximum output, vaporizing neural tissue faster than consciousness could process its own destruction. Monomolecular blades through the brainstem, severing the connection between mind and body in microseconds of objective time. Some failed. Those were the worst cases by far. A man named Petrock tried to overdose on medical sedatives, hoping to slip peacefully into death through simple respiratory depression. standard suicide method historically reliable across countless cultures. Instead, he experienced 60,000 years of slow asphyxiation, as his respiratory system gradually shut down, his consciousness fully aware the entire time, trapped in a body that was dying by microscopic degrees, while his mind experienced every microsecond as its own distinct eternity. He felt every cell in his body begin to starve for oxygen, felt the cascade of biochemical failures as his metabolism collapsed across what his consciousness interpreted as millennia, felt his neurons firing desperately for fuel that wasn't coming while subjective centuries passed. They found him 4 hours later, still technically alive by most medical definitions. His heart was beating. His brain showed electrical activity, but his eyes were gone. He'd clawed them out at some point during the subjective millennia of his dying, trying to make the experience stop through self-inflicted blindness. Didn't work, of course. Consciousness doesn't need eyes, doesn't require sensory input to experience duration. He'd just experienced 60,000 years of darkness instead of 60,000 years of staring at his quarter's ceiling. Traded one form of sensory deprivation for another, while the fundamental horror of stretched consciousness remained unchanged. Hadrian, the medical officer, euthanized him with a direct brainstem injection, made sure the neurodestruction was instantaneous, used a neurotoxin that would cascade through his cortex faster than action potentials could propagate. Mercy, he called it, though the Imperium would have considered it murder of Imperial personnel. The Imperium would have called it murder, heresy, dereliction of duty, violation of the sacred trust placed in medical personnel to preserve life rather than end it. Out here, 10 years into our journey according to the ship's chronometry, but subjectively? Subjectively, some of us have been traveling for hundreds of thousands of years by that point, had experienced more duration than human civilization had existed, had been conscious longer than recorded history. Out here, concepts like duty and law and the emperor's sacred authority felt like distant myths, stories told by people who'd never experienced consciousness stretched across geological timescales, while their bodies aged normally, who couldn't comprehend what it meant to live through millennia in days. I tried to pray once during this period, tried the rituals they'd taught us, the comforting mantras about the God Emperor's eternal protection. The propaganda they drilled into us during training. In his name we find sanctuary. In his light we find purpose. He protects the faithful across all distances and all times. I knelt in the ship's chapel, a small compartment on Deck 3 decorated with imperial aquillas and purity seals, lit by flickering electro candles that the tech priests insisted were more spiritually appropriate than standard lighting, and recited the prayers I'd been taught during my childhood on the agri-world. Experienced 4,000 years of praying, nothing answered. No divine presence, no comforting warmth, no sense of protection or purpose, or anything except the mechanical repetition of syllables that meant nothing, changed nothing, helped nothing. Just 4,000 years of my own voice echoing in my skull, begging for salvation that never came, pleading with a corpse on a throne 10,000 light years away who couldn't hear and wouldn't care if he could. The Emperor, if he'd ever been anything more than a powerful psyker and skilled general, was long dead, had been rotting in that throne for millennia. And the Imperium's insistence that he somehow still protected humanity was just propaganda designed to maintain social control. When I stood up, 16 minutes had passed, according to the chapel's chronometer. The Imperium's promises were lies. The Emperor's protection was propaganda. Faith was just psychological conditioning designed to make us compliant, to make us accept suffering as somehow meaningful, when the truth was suffering was just suffering, meaningless and eternal and inescapable. 4,000 years of prayer had taught me that lesson more thoroughly than any heretical text could have. The prayers went unanswered because there was nothing to answer them. The rituals were empty because they'd always been empty. The comfort people claimed to find in faith was self-delusion, the mind protecting itself from existential horror by inventing meaning where none existed. I stopped praying after that. So did most of us who'd bothered to try. Month 14, objective time. The ship's population had dropped to 2,300 men through suicides, failed suicide attempts that resulted in death, and a handful of stress-related medical emergencies where men's hearts simply gave out from exhaustion. Consciousness stretched across subjective millennia, while the body experienced days. Eventually, the nervous system couldn't maintain the disconnect. The autonomic functions that kept us alive weren't designed to support awareness across such vast timescales. Some men's brains just stopped, overwhelmed by the sheer cognitive load of processing centuries of experience compressed into hours, their neural networks burning out like overloaded circuits. The senior tech priests tried to repair the reactor fracture during this period. Spent 3 weeks, objective time, attempting to patch the containment shielding using what they called sacred sealing rituals, but which were actually just basic material science dressed in religious theater to obscure the fact that they didn't fully understand the technology they were supposedly maintaining. Felt like 9,000 years of failed repairs. Every attempt made things worse. The radiation, whatever it was, exotic particles or warp contamination or something physics hadn't named yet, was spreading. Deck by deck, compartment by compartment, the temporal distortion intensified. Early on, when we'd first noticed the symptoms, we'd experienced subjective hours when minutes passed. By month 14, we were experiencing subjective years when seconds passed. The ratio was accelerating. The disconnect between consciousness and objective time was growing exponentially rather than linearly. I watched Darius die during that period. Not quickly, not mercifully. He was working on VAT-31, routine maintenance, replacing a worn seal on one of the nutrient flow valves, when he accidentally cut his hand on sharp metal. Minor injury. Should have bled for a minute, maybe 2. Before the natural clotting cascade sealed the wound. Basic physiology, nothing complicated. He experienced 800 years of bleeding. I found him collapsed on the deck plates, still alive somehow, making sounds that barely qualified as human vocalization. The cut had clotted after 90 seconds, objective time, confirmed by the chronometer on my wrist. But his mind had lived through 8 centuries of pain, while his body performed a 90-second autonomic function. 800 years of feeling blood leave his body, of watching the wound slowly seal through processes that operated on cellular timescales, of experiencing every microsecond of the clotting cascade as its own distinct eternity. "Marcus," he whispered when I knelt beside him. His voice was ancient, weathered by subjective millennia of suffering, hollowed out by experiences no human psychology was designed to process. "Marcus, I can't. I've been bleeding forever. I'm still bleeding. It won't stop. The blood keeps leaving, and I can count every drop, can feel every cell that exits through the wound, and it's been 800 years, Marcus. 800 years of bleeding from a hand wound, and it won't stop. It's still happening. Time doesn't pass here, it just accumulates." "It did stop," I told him, showing him his hand. The cut was sealed, barely even visible under the dried blood crusted around the wound site. He stared at it like I was lying, like I was showing him a comfortable illusion while reality continued to torture him. His eyes had that quality I'd seen in other men. The look of someone who'd experienced too much duration, whose consciousness had stretched so far across time that it couldn't contract back to normal perception anymore. No, it's still, I can feel it. 800 years of feeling the blood leave my body drop by drop, and I can remember every drop. Marcus, I can count them. Can recall each one individually across the 8 centuries it took for 90 seconds to pass. And it's still happening in my memory, which means it's still happening in my experience, which means it never stopped. Time doesn't work the way it should anymore. Past and present are the same thing, and I'm buried under all of it. His voice rose to a scream, then stopped abruptly. His eyes went distant, focusing on something I couldn't see, some internal landscape of stretched consciousness that I could only imagine. I realized he'd just experienced another century of awareness in the second it took him to scream. "Help me die," he said eventually. Might have been 2 seconds later in objective time. Felt like 10 years to him. I could see it in his eyes, could recognize the signs of temporal displacement because I'd experienced it myself countless times. "Please, please, Marcus. We were friends, are friends, will be friends. Tense doesn't work anymore. Grammar assumes sequential time, and time isn't sequential here. It's all happening simultaneously. Past and future collapsed into an eternal present that never ends, and I can't be conscious anymore. Consciousness is torture. Every moment I remain aware is another eternity of experiencing awareness, and I needed to stop. I helped him die. Won't describe how in detail. Won't give the specific methodology, only that I made sure it was fast, objectively fast, seconds rather than minutes, so his subjective experience of dying would be measured in mere decades rather than millennia. Used one of the plasma welders from the maintenance locker, set to maximum output, applied directly to his brainstem. Neural tissue vaporized faster than pain signals could propagate. Still took 3 seconds of objective time. Still meant he experienced decades of dying. But decades were better than the millennia he'd have experienced through slower methods. His last words were, "Thank you." Not sure if he meant it. Decades of dying, even relatively quick decades, might have changed his perspective in those final moments, might have made him regret the request. No way to know. I burned his body in the ship's incinerator afterward. Standard procedure for void deaths. Can't keep corpses aboard a sealed vessel indefinitely. The decomposition gases contaminate the air recycling systems and create biohazards that threaten the surviving crew. Took 4 minutes to cremate him completely, to reduce his physical form to ash and trace minerals. Felt like 60 years of watching my friend burn. 60 years of standing in front of the incinerator port, watching flames consume the only person aboard this ship I'd actually cared about. Experiencing every second of the cremation stretched across decades of subjective mourning. Month 18, objective population 1,400 men. Subjective population, impossible to calculate because we'd all experienced different durations of consciousness depending on our activities and sleep patterns and random variations in how the radiation affected individual neurology. Some men claimed they'd been aboard the ship for 1,000,000 years. Others insisted it had been tens of millions. A few had lost the capacity for numerical reasoning entirely. Their consciousness had stretched across such vast subjective timescales that concepts like years or centuries no longer had meaning. That quantifying duration had become impossible because the numbers required to express their experiences exceeded human cognitive capacity. Time had become something we drowned in. An ocean of moments that never ended, never progressed, just accumulated in crushing layers while our bodies continued their normal biological functions and the ship's chronometers ticked forward at their regular, mocking pace. We'd become prisoners of consciousness itself, trapped in awareness that extended across impossible durations while physical reality continued unchanged. The hydroponics bay where I'd worked, past tense felt more appropriate even though I was technically still assigned there, had become a kind of hell perfectly calibrated to my individual psychology. I'd start a simple task, adjusting a nutrient flow valve, 30-second job in objective time. Would experience 2,000 years of turning that valve. Every microscopic rotation of the mechanism stretched across decades of subjective time. I could feel the metal threads engaging with microscopic precision, could experience every molecule of the turning process as its own distinct event spread across vast duration. My consciousness had apparently learned to perceive reality at quantum-scale temporal resolution, while my body moved at normal speed, creating an impossible disconnect where I experienced geological timescales while performing mundane actions. I could feel individual atoms sliding past each other as the valve rotated, could experience the electromagnetic forces binding molecules together, could perceive reality at scales human consciousness wasn't designed to access. The worst part, I couldn't stop perceiving at that resolution. Couldn't turn it off or dial it back to normal human consciousness. The radiation had fundamentally altered my neurology, not physically. The medical scans still showed normal brain structure, but functionally. My subjective experience of duration had become untethered from objective reality in ways that were probably permanent, that would continue regardless of whether we ever fixed the reactor or escaped the radiation field. Other men reported similar effects. A technician named Aldous told me he'd experienced 400,000 years while eating a single meal. Every bite stretched across millennia, the texture of corpse starch against his tongue, the mechanical process of chewing, the slow journey of matter through his digestive tract. He could feel the food breaking down at molecular levels, could experience his stomach acid dissolving proteins across vast timescales, could sense the individual chemical reactions required to convert nutrients into metabolic energy, all while objectively the meal took him 12 minutes to consume. "I can't eat anymore," he said. His eyes had a hollow quality, like staring into abandoned hab blocks where nothing living remained. "Can't make myself do it." The thought of experiencing another eternity just to consume nutrients. I'd rather starve. At least starvation is temporary. At least dying from hunger has an end point, even if I'll experience millennia of cellular breakdown before my consciousness finally stops. It wasn't, though. Nothing was temporary anymore. Even death had become complicated. Another man, I forget his name. We'd stop using names consistently because identity itself was becoming fluid across such vast subjective durations, tried to starve himself to death. Went 43 days without food before his body gave out. Objective time. 43 days. Subjective time for him? He claimed later, after they resuscitated him against his will, that he'd experienced 8 million years of starvation, 8 million years of feeling his body consume itself, of experiencing the cascade of biochemical failures as his metabolism cannibalized muscle tissue and organ function degraded and his brain began shutting down non-essential processes to conserve energy. They'd found him technically dead, heart stopped, brain activity minimal, and Hadrian had resuscitated him using standard medical protocols, brought him back from clinical death. He'd never forgiven Hadrian for that. The resurrection. Told anyone who'd listen that he'd finally achieved oblivion after 8 million years of suffering, had finally escaped consciousness, and then been dragged back into awareness against his will to experience more infinite duration. Killed himself again 3 days later using a plasma cutter to the brainstem. Made sure to destroy the medical bay's resuscitation equipment first, so they couldn't bring him back a second time. Month 2004. 2 years objective time since departure from Terra. The ship's population had dropped below 1,000 men. We'd lost more than 2/3 of our original complement to suicide, medical failures, and what the official logs euphemistically called temporal displacement syndrome casualties. The tech priests had given up trying to repair the reactor. The fracture was spreading, not physically, but conceptually, like reality itself was cracking around the damaged containment field. The temporal distortion had expanded to encompass the entire ship. There were no safe compartments anymore, no shielded areas where consciousness operated normally. Every man aboard experienced the same fundamental disconnection between subjective awareness and objective time. I stopped sleeping entirely around this period, not through discipline or stimulant abuse, but because my consciousness had stretched so far across subjective time that the distinction between waking and sleeping no longer meant anything. I'd close my eyes and experience millennia, open them and experience millennia. The only difference was whether I had visual input during the eternal duration of consciousness. Sleep became just another state of awareness rather than a period of rest, another mode of existing across impossible timescales. The tech priests started dismantling themselves around month 30. Their faith, their conditioning that insisted the machine god was real, and the Omnissiah would protect them and all the comfortable lies the Mechanicus used to make sense of the universe, finally broke under the weight of Subjective millennia. They'd been praying longer than anyone, had spent more time performing rituals and chanting litanies and begging their supposed deity for intervention. Nothing had answered. Had never answered. After experiencing subjective millions of years of unanswered prayer, even the most thoroughly indoctrinated tech priest couldn't maintain the delusion anymore. They started removing their augmetics, tearing out the mechanical components they'd spent their lives installing and maintaining and worshipping. I watched one of them, a senior priest who'd been aboard since departure, methodically disassemble his own body over the course of what he later told me was 6,000 years of subjective time. Objective time, 4 hours. But for him, it was 6 millennia of carefully removing each augmetic component, each blessed mechanical enhancement, trying to find where his humanity ended and the machine began, trying to locate the boundary between consciousness and mechanism so he could destroy one or the other. He never finished, bled out when he removed his augmetic heart without having a biological replacement, died screaming that the machine god was a lie, that the Omnissiah had never existed, that they'd wasted their lives worshipping algorithms and circuit patterns that had no more divinity than a standard cogitator. The rest of the tech priests followed over the subsequent months. All of them eventually confronted the same truth. Their faith was empty, their god was fictional, their rituals were meaningless. Some went quietly, simply removing life-sustaining augmetics and letting their bodies fail. Others went violently, destroying the machinery they'd once considered sacred, smashing blessed components and defiling sacred archives in fits of rage against the lies they'd been taught. I felt no satisfaction watching their faith crumble, no vindication that the religious theater I'd always suspected was false had been proven definitively empty. Only sadness that it had taken subjective millennia of suffering to break through their conditioning, that they'd wasted so much time, both objective and subjective, serving fictions. Month 43. The ship's population had dropped to 300 men. We'd effectively stopped functioning as a colony mission. The hydroponics bays were failing because nobody could tolerate the subjective eternities required to perform maintenance. The atmospheric recyclers were degrading. The reactor continued leaking its reality-warping radiation unimpeded. We were dying slowly, and dying took forever. I spent what felt like 17,000 years watching the ship decay around me. Objective time, maybe 6 months. But subjectively, I experienced every moment of the slow collapse, every system failure across vast durations, every minor malfunction stretched into years-long crises. The lights would flicker, and I'd experience decades of intermittent darkness. The temperature would drop, and I'd experience centuries of gradual cooling. Every small change became an epic journey through time. Some men tried to reach the escape pods, thinking maybe they could jettison themselves into space and die through explosive decompression before experiencing too much subjective time. Found the pods locked. Safety protocols designed to prevent accidental launches also prevented intentional ones without proper authorization codes. The command staff who'd had those codes were all dead by suicide months earlier. We were trapped aboard a decaying ship, experiencing the heat death of our small universe across subjective eternities, while objective time measured the process in months. Month 55, population 97 men. We'd stopped maintaining most ship systems, stopped eating regularly because every meal was an eternity, stopped communicating because conversations took subjective centuries, and we'd forgotten how to compress thoughts into speech. Most of us just existed in isolation. Our consciousnesses stretched so far across time that we'd become effectively immortal from a subjective perspective. We'd experienced more duration than human civilization had existed, had been aware longer than stars had been burning, had consciousness spanning timescales that approached the age of the galaxy itself. I tried to count once, tried to calculate how long I'd been subjectively conscious since the radiation leak began. Made it to 400 million years before I lost track, before the numbers became meaningless, before I realized that quantifying my suffering didn't reduce it. That was probably around month 60. Year 5 since departure, The ship's trajectory was still taking us toward Proxima More, still following our original flight plan because nobody had bothered to correct course, and there was no point anyway. We'd never establish a colony, never build those gardens I'd imagined during the early months, never fulfill the mission we'd been sent to accomplish. We were just consciousness, trapped in failing biological containers, experiencing eternity while our bodies aged normally, drowning in time while the universe continued indifferent. Some men found ways to cope. A technician named Voss, one of the last 97, discovered he could fragment his consciousness through specific meditation techniques, could split his awareness into multiple parallel streams, experiencing different durations simultaneously. Didn't reduce the total subjective time he experienced, but distributed it across multiple perspectives that somehow made it more bearable, like suffering divided among several selves rather than concentrated in one awareness. He tried to teach others. Most couldn't learn the technique. Our consciousness had already stretched too far, become too diffuse to concentrate into the focused state required for meditation. I tried once, spent what felt like 2,000 years attempting to fragment my awareness, only to discover I'd already fragmented without intending to. I was experiencing multiple timescales simultaneously without conscious control. My mind splitting under the weight of too much duration. Month 72, 6 years objective time. Population 41 men. We'd stopped being human by any meaningful definition. Our bodies were still technically alive, hearts beating, lungs processing air. But our consciousnesses had experienced so much duration across such vast subjective timescales that human psychology had become irrelevant. We were more like geological processes than people, our awareness eroding and reshaping over millions of subjective years, while our physical forms remained unchanged. I met a man during this period, met is the wrong word, encountered a man, became aware of his presence, who claimed he'd been conscious for 6 billion years. Subjective time, he clarified, though clarification was unnecessary because we all understood by then that subjective and objective time had completely divorced. He'd apparently experienced roughly the age of the Earth since the radiation leak began, had processed more duration than complex life had existed on Terra, had been aware longer than mammals had been evolving. I remember the beginning, he told me. Conversation that took 3 hours objectively, but felt like 8,000 years subjectively. Remember being Marcus's friend. Remember having a name and an identity and thinking I was a person. But that was billions of years ago from my perspective. And I've changed so much since then that whoever I was at the beginning is effectively a different being, separated from my current self by more time than human history spans. I'm not human anymore. Not sure what I am. Just consciousness that continues experiencing duration while waiting for my biological substrate to fail. I realized he was talking about Darius. He'd been Darius's friend at the beginning, had known him before I did, and now he couldn't remember his own name because 6 billion subjective years of consciousness had eroded identity into abstraction. Made me wonder how long I'd been conscious. Millions of years? Billions? Had I exceeded Earth's age yet? Hard to track when you're experiencing multiple timescales simultaneously, when your awareness fragments across parallel streams of consciousness that process duration at different rates. Month 90, 7.5 years objective time. Population 8 men, including myself. We were the only survivors out of the original 3,000, and survivors was a generous term for what we'd become. Our bodies were failing. Malnutrition, system failures, the simple wearing out of biological mechanisms never designed to support consciousness across geological timescales. But we couldn't die. Every attempt at suicide had failed because dying took too long subjectively, because we'd experience eternities of death before cessation finally came. We were trapped in flesh that was slowly breaking down while our consciousnesses experienced every microsecond of decay as its own eternity. The ship finally arrived at Proxima Mo on month 96. 8 years objective time since departure from Terra. The automated systems, which had continued functioning normally because they didn't experience subjective time, began approach procedures, brought us into orbit around the colony world we'd been sent to settle. Nobody cared. We'd experienced billions of subjective years, traveling to a destination that no longer mattered. And now we'd arrived at a world we had no intention of colonizing, because we were no longer the men who'd departed Terra with dreams of gardens and legacy. I managed to access the external senses once, wanted to see what we'd traveled so far to reach. The planet looked habitable. Oxygen atmosphere, liquid water, temperature ranges compatible with human life. Would have been perfect for the colony we'd planned to establish. Didn't matter. We'd left humanity behind somewhere in the subjective millennia between departure and arrival. We were just consciousness trapped in decaying meat, waiting for biology to fail completely so our awareness would finally stop. The other 7 men died over the subsequent months. Their bodies simply gave out. Hearts stopped beating, organs failed, the biological systems maintaining life exhausted themselves. I watched each one die across subjective eternities, experiencing what felt like millions of years of witnessing their slow cessation, while objective time measured their deaths in hours or days. I was the last one alive on month 112, 9 years and 4 months since departure, 28 years old when I'd launched from Terra, 37 years old now in objective terms. Billions upon billions of years old in subjective terms, had experienced more time than the universe had existed, had been conscious across timescales that made geological ages seem brief, had awareness spanning durations human language couldn't express because we'd never needed words for numbers that large. My body is failing now. I can feel it, feel every cellular breakdown across eternities of biological decay. My heart beats once every few seconds objectively, but each beat spans what feels like centuries of subjective time. I can experience the electrical cascade through cardiac muscle fibers, can feel the chamber contractions from the perspective of individual cells, can sense the blood flowing through vessels at the microscopic scale where individual plasma proteins become visible. I'm dying, have been dying for what feels like 10 million years now. Every breath is a geological age. Every heartbeat is a civilization rising and falling. Every moment of continued consciousness is another eternity added to the infinite duration I've already experienced. The chronometer says I've been awake for 47 seconds since my last measurement. I've lived through 6,000 years. My name was Marcus Cale. I was an agricultural engineer sent to establish the Imperium's first deep space colony. I was 28 years old when I departed Terra, with dreams of making history, of building something that would outlast my brief human lifespan. I succeeded, though not in the way I'd imagined. I've outlasted empires now, have existed longer than stars burn, have been conscious across durations that make human history seem like a brief flickering in infinite darkness. The Emperor never protected us. The tech priest's machine god never answered. The Imperium's promises were lies designed to make us compliant. Faith was programming, not truth. Service led only to this eternal consciousness, trapped in failing flesh, experiencing forever while waiting for biological cessation that takes forever to arrive. This is what really happened to the first deep space colony. We're still here, technically. Still orbiting Proxima, moored in a decaying ship full of biological remains. Still experiencing time at impossible ratios while the universe continues unchanged. I am the last one conscious. I have been conscious for billions of years. I will be conscious for billions more before my body finally fails, and I cannot make it stop.